What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. I am here to examine another issue of the X-Men. Today, I'm examining X-Men issue 12 with the story by Stan Lee, layouts by Jack Kirby, penciling by Alex Toth, inking by Vince Colletta, and lettering by Sam Rosen. This issue picks up where last issue ended, where Cerebro is detecting a new menace that is more powerful than anything the X-Men have faced before, and this entire issue is interspersed with the X-Men booby-trapping the front lawn of the X-Mansion and the Juggernaut making it past each obstacle that they set up, and Professor Xavier explaining a little bit of his backstory and the origins of his stepbrother, Kane Marco, the Juggernaut, who is the villain that this issue is featuring. And there are several things to unpack here, even though this issue is really only half of a story. Number one, in my talk about the first issue, I mentioned that Professor X would have been born after his parents started working at Alamogordo, because later on in Marvel Comics, the definition of a mutant is somebody who has had their abilities since birth, but they didn't manifest until puberty. And that's how almost every mutant is. They are born this way, but their powers don't show up until they're a teenager. And that is kind of contradicted in this issue. So we get to see that the definition of a mutant is not quite worked out in this issue in a couple of different places, because we see that Professor X was maybe anywhere from 6 to 8 whenever his parents started working at Alamogordo, and so presumably he got bombarded with radiation from being near the nuclear site, and it wasn't his parents passing it on to him. And it's really difficult to tell just how old Professor X is in these flashbacks, and that's not a diss against any of the artists involved with this issue. I think any artist would have trouble drawing a 6-year-old and then drawing an 8-year-old and trying to make them look different. So that's not a diss against anyone involved with this issue, but during all of the flashbacks, unless he would say, I was in college at this time, it was really difficult to tell just how old Professor X or Kane Marco was supposed to be. But anyway, Professor X was at least 6 years old, I would say, when his father died. So that would have been like 1943 or so. So when Professor X was thinking about how much he loved Jean Grey, and I said it was creepy but not that creepy, well, it's a little bit more creepy now, because he would be at least 26 or so at the time of these issues, while the X-Men would be anywhere from 16 in the case of Iceman to 18 in the case of the other X-Men. So just wanted to clarify that, something that I was mistaken about in issue 1, and these flashbacks here show that Professor X was born after, or was born before his parents started working at Alamogordo. And then also, this issue a couple times calls the Juggernaut a mutant. There are a few times where some of the X-Men say something like, is this a mutant menace, or something like that, and I guess they wouldn't know any better, but then Professor X doesn't correct them. He doesn't say, no, Juggernaut is not a mutant. He just talks about how, I have to tell you this story, I owe it to you, I owe you this much, stuff like that. So this issue seems to think that Juggernaut is a mutant, but it gives us his origin story in the flashbacks. It shows us that during the Korean War, and it actually mentions the Korean War, Professor X and Juggernaut, they were both fighting in Korea, and then Juggernaut decided he was going to walk away, he was going to go hide in a cave, and that's where he found the gem of Sidorak. I don't know if it's Sidorak or Sidorak, and if you have been reading Silver Age Doctor Strange comics, around this same time, Doctor Strange will often swear by the Crimson Bands of Sidorak. So it's interesting that here, Professor X mentions that Sidorak was a dark mystical elemental or something like that from thousands and thousands of years ago, and he was driven off of this plane of existence, and then that's around the time when the gem manifested on Earth. So here, we're being told that Sidorak is bad news, and pretty much ever since this issue, Sidorak has been presented as a bad guy when he appears, and if he isn't appearing, then at the very least, good guys like Doctor Strange are not swearing by his name anymore after this issue. So that's a fun little sort of crossover here. I get the feeling that basically Stan Lee was just trying to think of a really cool name, and he just used a name that he had already come up with in Doctor Strange, and then that kind of informed later Doctor Strange comics, where he was no longer using the curse of the Crimson Bands of Sidorak. So anyway, there's not a whole lot else to talk about here. We do get to see that Juggernaut's personality is pretty much the same as it will be for the next 40, 50 years. Whenever Chris Claremont gets around to using Juggernaut in some of his stories during his run, he plays him as being a little less malicious. Here, Juggernaut actually almost kills Charles by trying to scare him driving a car. He offers to drive Charles to college, and then he starts going really fast around this curvy, hilly road, and then he actually jumps out of the car, and Professor X gets injured in the car wreck. It doesn't cost him the use of his legs. He mentions that, no, that was the alien Lucifer that you guys have met already, but which I guess technically we don't know that Lucifer is an alien, but I'll go ahead and tell you Lucifer is an alien. But anyway, so Juggernaut Kane, he almost gets Charles killed. So he is very evil here, even before he gets touched by the Crimson Gem of Satarak. But later on, other writers will play him as being just kind of a jerk, a little bit thuggish, but not necessarily evil. There are several times that I can think of in the late 70s and 80s where the X-Men fight him, and they're the ones who pick the fight, and he really wasn't doing anything. They just say, like, oh, there's the Juggernaut over there, let's go fight him. And that happened at least twice, maybe 3 times. So that's one of those things that his characterization has changed a little bit later on, but a lot of it is established here. He's just toned down just a little bit in later years, but his origin is given to us here, and that pretty much remains unchanged in later years. Him fighting in war, obviously, whenever you get into the 1980s and Juggernaut and Charles would have been way too old to have fought in Korea, they change it to just a war that they were fighting in. But here, it kind of gives you a pretty good idea of exactly when Charles would have come back to America and fought and founded the X-Men, because he would have lost the use of his legs after Korea. So it kind of gives you a good idea of how long the X-Men have been around. And we see in X-Men issue 1 that that is their first mission. So they haven't been around much longer before that. Anyway, like I said, this really is only half of a story. It gives you a lot of backstory on Juggernaut, but in the present day, it's basically just Professor X saying, okay, he got through another barrier, let me finish telling you my story. And then Juggernaut makes it into the mansion by the end of the issue and says, well, it's my dear brother, now I'm going to kill you. Not really a full story here. It will be continued in next issue. It is a little bit silly that at one point near the end of the issue, Beast actually says, hey, if he gets in, can't you just shut down his mind? And obviously this is a reference to issues 2 and 3 of this series, where Professor X did just that, where he blocked the Vanisher's powers, and he also made Blob forget that he had ever met the X-Men. And Charles says, I've been trying to do that, and I haven't been able to get in his head. And so he blames it on a mystical defense that Kane got whenever he got the powers of Sidorak. And so that is something that they're going to address next issue. But I would think if Charles knows that he cannot get into Kane's head, then instead of sitting around telling these guys the origin story of the Juggernaut, he needs to send somebody to go and get somebody who can figure out why they can't get inside his head. Go find Dr. Strange in New York. Figure out why we can't get inside his head. And then once you figure that out, then you can go ahead and get past that defense and then get inside his head. And they will be doing more of that in next issue, but it is a little bit silly that basically Professor X is like, yeah, he's coming. Nothing can stop him. He's the most powerful thing on the planet. So let's all sit in a circle and it's time for story time. It's a little silly, but it's still building up tension. And that's probably what they were going for. This is the most tense issue of this series so far, I would say. Even when Professor X lost his powers in, I want to say, X-Men issue 4, even when that happened, that wasn't as tense or mind-blowing as this issue is, where everything is building up to the Juggernaut showing up. And I will say, in the issue, they kind of shroud him in shadows until the last page, and he finally shows up, and you get to see him in his full glory. But then on the cover, you get to see him in his costume. Now, his back is facing the audience, but you still get to see him in his costume. You still get to see that he's wearing a helmet. So if they were going to show us that much on the cover, I don't know why they went through so much trouble keeping him a secret until the last page of this issue. That's just another minor nitpick. So overall, I don't have a whole lot more to say about this issue. This is kind of the beginning of a new era as far as the creative team goes. We now have Vince Colletta and Alex Toth working on these issues. Jack Kirby was working on a lot of stuff at the time. Fantastic Four. I know he was working on Avengers for a little while. By this point, I don't know if he was still on Avengers, though. And then I believe at one point he started working on Thor, but it might have been a little bit later. He was working on Hulk while that was going on. I think that series had ended before this point. And then I think he was doing the Ant-Man / Giant Man stories in Tales to Astonish. So he was doing quite a bit of stuff at Marvel at this time. Whenever Captain America gets his own stories in Tales of Suspense, he was drawing those. So he was really busy at this time. So by this point, he's already kind of backing out of X-Men. He's doing layouts, which is basically just really loose pencils, basically just a guideline for Alex Toth saying, okay, here's what you can do, here's all the stuff and how you're going to put it in this panel. And then Alex Toth would do tighter pencils, and then Vince Colletta would come in and do the ink. And we haven't seen Vince Colletta before up until this point, because if I'm not mistaken, Jack Kirby was actually doing, well, no, I was going to say Jack Kirby was doing the inking, but Chick Stone was actually doing the inking. So I'm not sure what happened with Chick Stone. He's a name that you don't really hear a lot of in regards to the Silver Age of Marvel, so he may have been really busy also. I don't know. Vince Colletta is a name that you hear quite a bit when compared with Jack Kirby. A lot of times he inked Kirby. Some people think for the worse, some people think for the better. But this is the first time we see him working on an issue with Kirby in the X-Men. So that's about all that I have to say. I hope that you guys like this issue, and I hope that you will come back the next time that I examine an issue. In the meantime, consider this issue examined.